Hello, I'm Roberta Spaulding, a member of the Congo mission team at Lafayette Orinda Presbyterian Church in California, and also advocacy chair in the Congo Mission Network. This slide lists some of the differences among ethnic groups with respect to getting COVID in the United States. Who is most likely to get COVID? What are the ethnic differences in the severity of disease between various groups? What are the ethnic differences in vaccination rates? And what are the differences for not becoming vaccinated? In order to discuss these differences, we need to look at the different ethnic groups in the United States. In 2019, just over 60% of the population was white. 18.5% of the population is Hispanic. 12.2% of the population is Black or African American. And 5.6% of the population is Asian. The remaining 4% of the population, which was not represented in the previous page, are shown below. But only 0.2%, less than 1% of the population in the U.S. are Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islanders. Almost 3% identify themselves as belonging to more than one race or one major ethnic group. And 0.7% are identified as American Indian or Alaska Natives, what we now call First Peoples or Inuit. The chart on the next page shows hospitalizations and deaths in comparison with white people. For example, you will see American Indians and Inuits are 2.4 times as likely to die as white people. When reporting disease and death in the United States, the American Center for Disease Control classifies everyone as either Hispanic or non-Hispanic. This chart shows significant differences in the rate of infection, the rate of hospitalization, and the death rate from COVID among various ethnic groups in the United States. For instance, if 100 white people come down with COVID, then 170 American Indian or Alaska Natives will become ill with it. And 110 Black or African Americans will become ill, and Hispanics, who have the highest rate of infection, 190 will become ill for every 100 white people that actually are infected. The hospitalization rate also shows significant differences. American Indian or Alaska Natives are 3.4 times as likely to be hospitalized as white people. In other words, for every 100 white people that go into the hospital, there will be 340 American Indian or Alaska Natives, and 280 African Americans will be hospitalized, as well as 280 Hispanics. Death rates also show significant differences. For every 100 deaths of white people, there will be 240 deaths of American Indians or Alaska Natives, 200 deaths of African Americans, and 230 deaths of Hispanic people. So you can see that the rates of death among most minorities in the United States are significantly higher. The only people who do not have higher rates of infection and death are Asians, non-Hispanic Asians. They are getting sick at only 0.7% of the rate that white people get. In other words, for every 100 white people who get sick, only 70 Asian non-Hispanic people will be ill. But their hospitalization rate and death rates are the same as white people. So what causes these terrible differences? Much of it is caused by past and current discrimination which cause poverty, and which also cause chronic diseases such as hypertension or high blood pressure and diabetes. Many of these factors were discussed by Dr. Mimi Kanda last year at the CMN conference, and her presentation is still on the CMN YouTube channel. If you have not watched it, I strongly encourage you to do so. In fact, I think it's even worth re-watching to see a lot of the causes of the differences between white Americans and African Americans and what happens because of these differences. And these differences have caused a lot of lack of trust in the U.S. healthcare systems. So what causes this huge lack of trust in the U.S. healthcare system among several minority people? Well, one of the first and major causes of lack of trust is exploitation. And one thing that I'm going to talk about is an experiment using African American men just to study syphilis. In this syphilis experiment, U.S. doctors recruited 600 men from Macon County, Georgia, by promising free health care. 400 of the men had beginning syphilis. The doctors did not treat the syphilis even after 1947, when it was discovered that penicillin would cure it. If a man had heard about penicillin and he asked for it, and it was given to him. However, others were not told about this cure. A second reason for the huge differences in health between African Americans and white people was segregated health care. Even up until the 1960s and 70s, in some places, particularly the South, where slavery was prevalent, there were a lack of clinics and hospitals that would treat African Americans. The white doctors who were there would not treat African Americans, and the few segregated hospitals that did exist were very poorly funded in comparison with hospitals for white people. So therefore, their equipment and the care that they could give was substandard in comparison with what the white hospitals were providing. There are huge differences in the health of American Indians as compared with white Americans. And one of the biggest causes of this is the reservation system. There was forced migration onto the reservation. In other words, people were uprooted from the places where they were living, and they were forced to walk many miles, sometimes hundreds of miles, to a new location in which they were forced to live. The Cherokees called it the Trail of Tears because so many of them became ill and died marching from Tennessee to Oklahoma. These reservations were not large enough for traditional hunting and gathering, which were the way that the American Indians supported themselves. And the reservation land was too dry, too alkaline, or too hilly and rocky to farm. So the people that were forced onto these reservations had usually no way of supporting themselves. Another cause of the large differences between the health of American Indians and that of white people is cultural insensitivity. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was created by the U.S. government to manage the reservations and to promote assimilation. The people who were employed by the Bureau often expressed contempt for Native American customs and technology. They also promoted the use of English exclusively, and they did this by creating schools for children. And at school, the children were punished for speaking the language they learned at home. The Bureau of Indian Affairs manages the Indian Health Service, which was created to build and run hospitals and clinics on the reservation. However, many of the doctors and nurses in these hospitals and clinics are often intolerant and condescending. Even worse, the Indian Health Service created a deliberate sterilization program for young women. From the 1950s up to 1970 or so, many young women were deliberately sterilized and did not know it. In 1976, the United States General Accounting Office admitted that this took place in 4 of the 12 Indian Health Service regions. There are other significant differences in health among various ethnic groups in the United States that are caused by social constraints. And one of the largest one of these is the lack of health insurance and poverty. If you don't have health insurance in the United States, you put off getting care until you're so sick that you have to go to the emergency room. In 2020, about 31 million Americans did not have health insurance. Also, the Urban Institute projected that the poverty rate for 2020 would be 9.2% among all groups. While the overall poverty rate was estimated at 9%, the rate for major ethnic groups differed significantly among them. The rates were for white people 6.6%, whereas black people, the rate of poverty was estimated to be 15.2%, and for Hispanic people at 13.8%. Another social constraint which causes big differences in the health between one ethnic group and another is lack of personal time. People who are poor often are working more than one job because their first job does not pay enough for them to support themselves or their family. And because they need to rent their place of residence in a place that's affordable, they have long commutes to work, sometimes leaving at 5 or 5:30 in the morning and not getting home until 6 or 6:30 in the evening. People who are poor also often have child care responsibilities, or they may be caring for an ill person or an elderly person in their family. And often in poor areas there are no clinics or pharmacies in their area, so it's very difficult for them to get basic health care. Another constraint which can cause differences in health outcomes among various groups is lack of transportation. This sign is in a community near where I live, and of course it's requesting volunteers to help drive our seniors or elderly people to the places that they need to go. Not everyone has a car or a motorcycle. The poor and elderly in rural areas often depend on others to take them shopping or to see a doctor. The people on whom they depend may have to work during the hours that a doctor can see them. If a person is frail, no matter where they live, they may need others to help them shop. Another constraint that can affect health outcomes is lack of space. Where many people live in the same home, they are more likely to infect each other as each person is out meeting many different people. They may bring the disease home and pass it on to others in their family. Many Hispanics and American Indians live in multi-generational households, sometimes in family compounds. White people less often live in households with 3 generations, and as many older white people do not live with others, it is easier for them to self-isolate. This greatly reduces their exposure to infected individuals, so they are less likely to become ill. Another constraint is social pressure, and this may work for or against vaccination. What we're going to look at in this chart is the percentage of the total population that has received at least one dosage of the vaccine between March 1st and August 2nd. Here are the groups. We have African Americans, Hispanics, white people, and Asians. On March 1st, 5% of Hispanics had received the vaccine. 7% of African Americans had received the vaccine. 11% of Asians and 13% of white people had received the vaccine. By the time we get to April, you can see that there are some changes happening. And so by then, 24% of African Americans had received the vaccine, but 25% of Hispanics, 38% of white people, and 45% of Asians. By the time we get to August 2nd, the differences between the groups have become even more pronounced. 38% of black people have received the vaccine, but 43% of Hispanics have received it. By this time, 49% of white people have received it, and they've kind of leveled off. And this has to do with vaccine hesitancy created by social pressure against becoming vaccinated. Whereas Asians, 66% of Asians have been vaccinated. And in the Asian community, there is a lot of pressure to become vaccinated because they have memories of SARS-CoV-1. So why do people avoid vaccination? This actually occurs in many countries. It's not just in the United States or in the DRC that you find vaccine avoidance. One German research group, led by Professor Cornelia Becht, found 5 reasons or factors that affect whether people are going to become vaccinated or not. Now, this group of researchers surveyed many people in many parts of Germany, and they finally pulled all of their findings together, and they were able to reduce it to these 5 reasons, which we'll show on the next slide. Here are the factors, or 5 C's, on why people avoid vaccination. Number 1 is confidence, or actually their lack of trust in its safety or efficacy. They just don't believe it's safe, or they don't believe it'll work. The second is complacency or confidence in the person's own health and ability to recover. They just feel that they're so healthy that they won't get the disease, or if they do, that they will have no trouble recovering fully. Confirmation bias is the third reason. Confirmation bias is due to a person's own calculations and study of vaccines and their possible side effects. But what often they look for is to confirm their pre-existing ideas. The 4th C is constraints or convenience of access. And in the previous slide, we discussed some of the social constraints such as lack of time, lack of space, or lack of transportation. The 5th C is collective responsibility to others. If people feel responsible to others, that they shouldn't get sick because of what they might be doing, then they'll get vaccinated. But if they don't have a feeling of collective social responsibility to protect others, then they'll tend not to become vaccinated. And we're finding a lot of this lack of collective responsibility or feeling of social responsibility in the United States at this time. The next slide will show a political map of the United States. The lighter the color, the fewer number of people are vaccinated. Some states' data were not available when the map was created. For the people that are 12 years old, that had only been recently authorized to be vaccinated, so there is insufficient data for them. Here you see the light color is little vaccination. The heavier the color, the more the vaccination. This slide is a map of the United States, and each of the states is outlined in white. And it shows the regional differences in vaccination among the various parts of the country. We have a few areas that are very, very dark green in which the vaccination rate is very, very high. This state in New Mexico and Arizona, these areas are primarily covered by Indian reservations, and they had such awful outcomes from COVID that there's a huge vaccination campaign in order to prevent more COVID cases and all the resulting hospitalizations and death rates. The same thing is true in Alaska, where the Inuit have pulled together and used a lot of social pressure to make sure that everybody gets vaccinated. You see some of the coastal areas of the United States have high vaccination rates, and also in New England, except New Hampshire or Vermont, they just didn't have any data. And some areas here have very high vaccination rates, and there's a lot of social pressure to become vaccinated, or just everybody seems to want to be vaccinated. But then you get here in certain areas, rural areas of the country, or areas in which people are very much opposed to vaccinations, and these are also the areas that are experiencing very high COVID rates, especially with the Delta variant. This slide is recorded on the 22nd of August and just discusses a few of the areas in which the unvaccinated and the Delta variant coexist. 35% of the American population is not vaccinated, and these are the people, of course, who are most susceptible to the Delta variant. There is so much vaccine refusal in certain parts of the country that on 11th of August, 80,000 doses of the vaccine expired in Arkansas. And this was despite even doctors, nurses, and every other health authorities begging people to become vaccinated. But now the Delta variant is causing 93% of the new cases as of 4th of August. And it is so infectious, it's so contagious, that now there's severe illness in children under 12. This is new, and it's all due to the Delta variant. The death rates among people and the hospitalizations are now so high that some of the least vaccinated communities are beginning to accept vaccination. So why has the United States become so politically and socially divided that there's a whole section of the population that refuses to get vaccinated against a deadly disease? One of the reasons is discussed by two economists, Mr. Mark Moreau and Jacob Whiting, writing in the Brookings Institute in 2019. They discussed two diverging economies in the United States, and this economic divergence is creating class differences. What has occurred has been the outsourcing of manufacturing to other countries. And with the outsourcing, very well-paying jobs were lost, and they were not replaced by other jobs. Then at the same time, we have technological, educational, and cultural changes, and these changes have led to arrogance. What has happened is that people who are technologically adept with computers and IT, and who have been educated and have also moved to the cities, have begun to disdain their fellow Americans who haven't been able to keep up with the kinds of changes that have occurred. So we have created urban snobbery towards the rural and small town culture of America. Now, while urban snobbery is very common historically, it is something new in the United States to have such widespread contempt for the vast majority of Americans who live in what is called the heartland, the central part and southern parts of the United States. So that we see that these socioeconomic divides create political polarization. In the United States, this is what we call the blue states versus the red states. And this political polarization has created a lack of trust in the elites among the people who live in the red states. Now I want to ask, why does a political divide cause a sizable percentage of the population to distrust the health information from the government? Why has health information become so politicized? While one may attribute the entire phenomenon to just one politician, that does not answer the question of why his statements appeal to such a large group of people. David Brooks, one political analyst, believes that, and I'm going to quote him, the U.S. has polarized into two separate class hierarchies, one red and one blue. Classes struggle not only up and down against the richer and poorer groups on their own ladder, but against their partisan opposites across the ideological divide. As the blue class have entrenched themselves culturally, educationally, economically, and politically, they have worked to ensure their continued success in much the same way previous aristocracies have fortified their privileges. And I reference the article in which this appears as the Atlantic September 2021 issue, and you can see the reference at the bottom of the page. So in summary, I have 4 conclusions. Arrogance and condescension create both resentment and distrust. Distrust fuels political polarization and contrary behavior. Lost trust takes a very long time to regain. But eventually the experience of disease and death among family, friends, and community changes behavior. Thank you. Merci.